The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Flight 459 ascended into the twilight sky, leaving the bright lights of New York City behind. It was a regular flight, one of hundreds that took off from JFK Airport each day, but for the 150 passengers aboard, this journey would end in tragedy. None of them knew it yet. In the cockpit, Captain James McAllister adjusted the flight controls, his face calm and focused. At 58, he had been a pilot for over 30 years, logging tens of thousands of flight hours. There was little that could surprise him, but something about tonight felt different. It was the weather reports. There were whispers of a developing storm, but it hadn't yet materialized. The skies above were clear for now. Beside him, First Officer Clara Hayes was typing out a quick message on her tablet, reviewing the route for the flight's descent into Los Angeles. She was younger, but she had already made a name for herself in the cockpit, respected by the crew and passengers alike for her sharp instincts and calm under pressure. "Looks good for the next few hours," Clara said, her voice breaking the silence. "No major turbulence forecasted. Just some minor clouds in the upper layers." James glanced over at her, offering a small nod. "Good. Let's keep an eye on the weather, just in case. Better safe than sorry." Back in the cabin, the passengers were settling in for the long journey. A mother tried to calm her restless child, while a businessman typed furiously on his laptop, oblivious to the world around him. Some passengers were already asleep, lulled by the gentle rocking of the plane. But in the sky, things were beginning to change. Outside the windows, the first hint of cloud cover started to form. It was just a thin layer at first, like a veil across the horizon. As the flight climbed to cruising altitude, the clouds thickened, but there was nothing unusual about it, typical of this time of year, and nothing to worry about. At 10,000 feet, the weather was still manageable. The lights in the cabin dimmed, and the flight attendants began their routine checks, moving down the aisles with calm professionalism. The mood was relaxed, with a few passengers chatting softly, others watching in-flight movies, and a few reading. In the cockpit, however, things were beginning to change. The first sign of trouble came when the aircraft's weather radar blinked on the screen. A faint line appeared, indicating a storm system ahead. It wasn't a huge concern yet, but it caught James' attention. "Clara, take a look at this," he said, pointing to the radar. "Storms forming ahead. We might need to adjust our course slightly." Clara leaned over to study the screen, her brow furrowing as she analyzed the data. "It's still pretty far off, but yeah, it's growing fast. Should we notify air traffic control?" James nodded, though he wasn't overly concerned just yet. "I'll keep an eye on it for now. Let's hold course, but keep our options open." As the minutes passed, the plane continued its journey across the vast, dark sky. The storm, however, wasn't waiting. It intensified rapidly, and soon the gentle rocking turned into a more noticeable shake, a reminder of the turbulence that lay ahead. The plane began to tremble as the turbulence intensified, and the air pressure in the cabin shifted. Passengers stirred, some looking out of their windows with wide eyes as the sky darkened and the storm clouds enveloped the aircraft. A few whispered nervously, but the flight attendants remained calm, their voices steady as they reassured everyone that this was just a typical storm. In the cockpit, James McAllister's hands gripped the controls a little tighter. He wasn't panicking, but there was a growing sense of urgency. The storm ahead was more aggressive than expected. Clara Hayes was monitoring the instruments closely, adjusting the altitude and speed in an attempt to minimize the turbulence. "We've got to get above it," Clara said, her voice laced with tension. "We need to climb to 35,000 feet, or we'll get caught in the worst of it." James nodded. "Roger that. Let's climb higher. We don't want to risk being stuck in this mess." The aircraft tilted slightly as the pilots pushed the plane upward, climbing through the turbulent air. The lights flickered overhead as the storm began to press down on the plane, but the engines roared steadily, fighting against the tempest outside. It was a battle of wills, man versus nature, but the plane was built to endure it. However, the storm was only the beginning of their problems. A warning light flashed on the dashboard, signaling a malfunction in the plane's radar system. "Clara, the radar's down," James said, his voice calm but with an edge of concern. "We can't see what's ahead." Clara's eyes widened as she quickly typed on her control panel, attempting to reinitialize the radar. But it was no use. Something was wrong with the system. They were flying blind through the storm, relying on their instruments and their experience to guide them. "James," Clara said, her voice now tinged with urgency, "we need to make a decision. If we don't change course, we could fly straight into the heart of this system. The turbulence could rip us apart." James took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. He had been through storms before, but this one felt different. He had always trusted his instruments, but now they were failing him. It was a pilot's worst nightmare, flying in a storm without the proper tools to navigate it. "We'll divert," James said, his voice firm. "We can't risk going further into this. Let's set a new heading." Clara quickly adjusted their course, but the storm was relentless. The aircraft continued to shake violently as the turbulence worsened. The descent began, but it felt like a drop into an abyss as the aircraft was tossed around in the sky. Passengers screamed, the overhead compartments rattling, and the seatbelt signs flashed on in a frenzy. The storm outside seemed to have no mercy. Each strike of lightning illuminated the cockpit in a blinding flash, followed by the deafening boom of thunder. Inside, the noise was overwhelming as the plane shook uncontrollably. Yet, James and Clara remained focused, each making split-second decisions to keep the plane in the air. "Altitude, James!" Clara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I see it," James replied, pushing the yoke forward slightly to bring the plane back to a safer altitude. But as the aircraft climbed and descended in the turbulent air, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled deeper into the storm, their options dwindling. At the back of the cabin, passengers clutched their armrests, their faces pale, but the crew continued to reassure them. The flight attendants moved quickly, checking on the passengers, offering calm words of comfort, but even they could feel the tension rising. This wasn't just another storm. This was something much worse. And then it happened. The plane lurched violently to the left. The engine sputtered, and the cabin plunged into darkness.